Okay, thank you for joining us today. We're going to be talking about current events in the context of immigration and also tax issues that can, tax and estate planning issues that can kind of come into those considerations in terms of either being concerned about uh, changing or losing status, being excluded from the US, or deciding to leave the US entirely if you feel like this is not a good place for you anymore. Um, so why don't we talk about sort of the current status of the legal environment right now? Um, and, we've all read the headlines and the news and things that are happening that are really unprecedented, at least in my lifetime. So, Steve, can you tell us a little bit more about the concerns that people have or they should have in terms of if they're not a US citizen, um, what are the kind of questions you're hearing, the issues that you're raising with clients?
Well, I think something, Shannon, that you and I, when we work with the same clients, we always try to do as much pre-immigration planning as possible, right? Speaking about people who are outside the US first. And that's a really difficult thing to do when we're in flux, like we saw with the original Muslim ban, for example, where all of a sudden people didn't know if they would be able to enter the US with a valid visa anymore. What happened during COVID, right? When there were a lot of barriers to entry. And now we're seeing all of these things exponentially, expanded on and maximized in so many different ways. There's an effort to remove people from the US, and we see that in the news. And that has included, for the first time that I can remember, like you said, these are unprecedented times, people who don't get due process, so they don't have their day in court. There's no formal proceedings whatsoever. And even some of them are green card holders, which is not even the lowest level of somebody with a temporary visa who could potentially be deported because they commit some sort of offense that makes them deportable. The higher you get up on the scale of non-immigrant or temporary resident to permanent resident to citizen, there should be enhanced protections. And we're not seeing those right now because there's no due process. So it is unprecedented times. And so we're getting calls of all kinds, like, can I travel and how do I know I'll be able to come back? There's this potential travel ban that will be on a scale that nobody has ever seen. The New York Times published the list of 43 countries that are classified as red, orange, or yellow, and those are the different scales. Red meaning no entry whatsoever, orange being more conditional but still difficult, and then yellow being less conditional. But there's a lot of countries that there are nationals from those countries that you and I work with, and they're very concerned about will they even be able to enter the United States. And then the last thing you mentioned about people giving up their green cards or even their citizenship, which is something I hadn't seen before very often, that's also trending in the other direction because people are just fed up and they want to know what happens when I give up my green card. And that's where you come in and the people that we work with that can plan for what the consequences on a tax level or an estate level are. But all of these things are on the rise right now.
Okay. Um, can you give us some tips, or listeners, some tips on, say you are here, either, I guess, actually, take a step back because
Okay.
I want to, even though you said that, we are seeing some convergence on how the level of process people are given and what their protections are, I do feel like it's helpful for people to understand like how those, at least in theory and previous to where we are now, and hopefully, the courts will rein some of this in, but we have no idea.
Right.
But if you can just explain, like, what are the protections, for example, a temporary visa holder has, what protections a legal permanent resident has, a green card holder, and what protections does a citizen have? And kind of take us through those, at least according to the laws that are on the books.
Yeah, well, I think the most important thing for people to understand now is that they need to practice a little bit more caution. And that means no matter which of those statuses someone might have, I think that they need to carry some sort of proof on them of that status. Because if they're lumped into the same group as somebody, who's illegal or who has overstayed because ICE rounds up a whole group of people, they need to be able to show that they have a valid visa, that they have an approval notice from immigration. If they have a green card, to have a copy of that. I don't think that I never recommend that people take originals and carry them because they might lose them. But certainly you want to carry proof of what your status is. There's something called an I-94 record, which every temporary visitor can look up online on the CBP website that shows that they're in status. It tells you until what time you're allowed to remain in the US. So people should probably print that out. The protections part is a difficult question to answer because technically anyone who's physically in the US should be given due process, meaning if they are charged with something that could be, lead to deportation, they should get a notice to appear in front of an immigration judge and be able to defend themselves. So the system, the law hasn't changed. The problem is, like you said, the courts have to, they have to interfere in this. If somebody has to bring a claim, and then they have to grant what's called a temporary restraining order, and then we'll see how that goes up the chain in terms of appeals and maybe the Supreme Court. So unfortunately, people will have to access the legal system and hire skilled attorneys to defend themselves. But the first thing they need to do is to carry those documents with them, because if they don't have any proof of their status, then ICE can just arbitrarily put them in holding, and then maybe, depending on how these cases are coming out, we've seen that, the hundreds of Venezuelans, for example, that were rounded up and put on a plane. Even after the judge granted the temporary restraining order, they still put people on a plane and sent them to El Salvador, Guantanamo, back to Venezuela. That could potentially happen, right, in other cases. So I don't want people to be paranoid because we're talking about a limited number of cases. But we also saw cases in New York City with a student from Colombia, for example, where freedom of speech now is apparently not allowed, right?
We saw
And
the
so,
student from Tufts as well.
yes,
I
and
don't
there's
think
more and
written
more of
op-ed
these.
is all that I can see that they're
And
charging.
I hate to say it, as two graduates of Georgetown Law and people who believe in transparency and in the Constitution, and that, if specifically due process and all these freedoms that anyone in the US should have, I do say to people, if you have opinions that are strong political opinions, it might not be a bad thing to just keep those to yourself for now, not go on social media and not publicly protest. And that's breaks my heart to say it because I think everybody should have that. It's an indomitable human right, according to our Constitution here. Not in every country, but a lot of foreigners come here and they love the fact that they can express themselves because maybe from where they're from they can't. But right now, I would tell people to keep those beliefs to yourself as much as possible because you may be targeted. So people have to be cautious and they have to practice a little bit of prevention, right? Don't put yourself out there in a way that could potentially get you in these situations where you might just be, not processed and removed, which is heartbreaking to think. I really believe everybody has their chance. They should have their chance in court to defend themselves, right? But that's not what we're seeing right now.
Yeah, and I think we still have to see in terms of what plays out with the courts in terms of the students, what if according to the laws, I could see it, is that on the books, it says that if the Secretary of State deems you to be some kind of risk to national security or something, like something having to do with national security, an adverse impact on national security, even I don't even think it's like a threat or a risk, that's grounds for deportation of a legal permanent resident. I don't think that has ever been challenged in court, that provision. So I think we will see what actual grounds do they have to produce in order to prevail on that claim. And that's, of course, hopefully, if assuming that there is a hearing and they're not just sort of somewhere summarily deported.
Right, and that's the problem is there are mechanisms in place, Shannon, for people to appeal and potentially get some sort of relief, and that sets a precedent so the government can't overstep. But if you're one of those people who was already removed, there's no precedent for what happens to those individuals when they're stuck in a prison in El Salvador, right? This is something we haven't seen before. You're supposed to go through these different steps and the checks and balances of our system. But right now, if you really put yourself out there, you're enhancing that risk that you may be one of those people that before these precedents are established and these blocks on the abuse of power by executive branch, Secretary of State, or whoever it is, are continuing to happen, then you're at greater risk. So I think eventually you're right. You're going to see these different scenarios go through the courts, and then there will be no way for the executive branch specifically. Most of these are through executive orders or executive actions to overstep. But in that interim phase, people have to be very cautious.
Okay, so tips are carry your paperwork with you at all times.
Yeah, and I think it's good to have in your back pocket a representative, somebody who knows how to defend you in those sorts of situations. Get a reference, put their phone number in your phone or in your back pocket in your wallet, so you have someone to call in case something happens. And then try to live your life after you've done those two things. Try to keep some semblance of sanity and balance and not be overly paranoid. There's a fine line between precaution and paranoia. And I think it's very hard to counsel people on how to navigate that. But it certainly is a horrible feeling to know that a lot of people don't feel welcome here like they might have in the past. And that leads them to second
Probably,
guess or to take,
yeah, not only not welcome, but not safe, right? It's like, yeah. Um,
right? The law is here to protect, but it's not able to do that when there are abuses of power, and that's what we're seeing right now. I don't think that this administration is unaware of where the boundaries are. I just think it knows how to push them as much as it can until it's officially, it has to officially stop. It's going to keep pushing those boundaries.
yeah, yeah, and we will see. I think we will have. I mean, I'm hoping at least the courts have been trying to rein some of this in. We haven't had something go up to the Supreme Court yet, but it's on its way. And
Yeah.
I think once we have judgments at that level, one will know, okay, where is that line? And, or at least have some idea. And then two, is the administration actually going to respect that or not?
That's
And
correct. Or find a new wrinkle somewhere like the 1798 Alien Enemies Act, which hasn't been invoked since World War II and now was invoked. They really are looking under every rock for ways to find the gray areas to be able to maneuver. And so people just have to be cautious and work with and have someone that they can confide in and trust in case they need to be defended. I think that's also important.
okay, so I think it is a good idea to have the contact information for an immigration attorney on you, kind of at all times, just in the hopefully, the very small chance, as you said, this is still small numbers that we're looking at here in terms of odds, but definitely just wanting to take some proactive precautions. And how about like leaving the US? And I think that this is where there is less protection when you're coming to the US, either coming back to the US or coming to the US for the first time. We're kind of seeing people being turned away at the border where
Yeah.
you wouldn't expect that before. What is your advice to clients who maybe are leaving to go visit family, that they have plans to do that? Uh, do you feel like that's still that maybe they should consider putting those plans on hold?
Yes, and that's case by case, right? If someone has an existing visa, the only barrier to entry they have is Customs and Border Protection when they return. And there is heightened scrutiny now at the borders, including airports. And so we're getting queries from people or clients that are saying, like one that I just got approved for an O1A visa, who's doing incredible things, and they took him into secondary inspection. He's originally from Hong Kong. They took him into secondary inspection and grilled him for an hour when he's created a technology that might prevent serious knee injuries for athletes around the world, and he wants to develop it in the US. If you can imagine, even manufacture it in the US. So just an incredible person that we want here. And he wrote a post saying, I felt like essentially like a criminal. I was treated like a criminal. He's a 23-year-old kid who's brilliant and has funding and will create a lot of jobs. So that to me means that anyone is susceptible to that level of inspection and harassment. The most problematic scenarios, Shannon, are where people leave the US and their current visas are expired, so they need to get stamped for a new one. Sometimes I advise them to just remain in the US and extend what's called an extension of status, as opposed to going to an embassy, because there are certain embassies right now that are really cracking down. And that's even for people with approved petitions from Immigration Service. Doesn't guarantee you a visa. So they have to understand that they're creating another barrier to entry if they leave. And so I am recommending this. And that's especially true now if there is a new travel ban. And we'll see if that's constitutional and if that is something that sticks or not, because it's not pandemic times. During pandemic times, there were certain parts of the law that were cited that had to do with health concerns that allowed the US to close its borders, right? But we don't have that situation now. So I'm curious to see what will occur with that. And those people that are on that New York Times, that if you look at the article, the 43 countries, they should have a one eye, out for what could potentially come, because that will affect their travel, potentially their businesses, and their family members too that have visas, depending on what, if this actually goes through and it goes into effect. So people, I think if they're here, if they don't have to travel, I would definitely recommend that they stay in the US right now.
At least until we get a little bit more clarity and
Correct.
things settle down a little more. Okay, and I just want to add in terms of the estate planning side and legal document side that if you don't have at least a power of attorney and a healthcare proxy, that those are things that you should have in place. Because if you were to get detained, get deported, it's really important that somebody be able to sign legal documents for you, to take actions on your behalf. So having that document in place is really important. And also, if you were outside of the US, you may need somebody here to be signing things for you, taking action on your behalf. And a healthcare proxy is also important to have that will allow somebody to have access to your healthcare records if you were detained and had health issues, had healthcare issues, medical issues. If you weren't able to make decisions for yourself because you were unconscious, having that document is really important. It both will allow somebody to make those decisions for you and also allow someone to have access to your medical records. So I would definitely, if you don't have those things in place, that it's a good idea to get those in place. Really, everybody should have those documents in place anyway. But I think during this time, especially if you're not a US citizen, that it's doubly important to make sure that those documents are done.
Yeah, I think that really applies, Shannon, to the last example we discussed too, about those who have some sort of temporary status here, where they're working, for example, or studying, and they travel overseas and they're either not allowed back in or they're not granted new visas. that could seriously affect them because they have their assets in the US, they have properties, they have family members, and all these scenarios need to be covered, before they're taking these trips. Because when you're barred from coming back in or you don't have a visa to enter, there's almost no possibilities of being able to legally access and come back, right? Access to the United States.
Yeah, I mean, there's things you can do abroad, but there are things that really you really need to be here for. Sometimes we can do a power of attorney even if you're outside of the US, but it can be a lot more challenging. You may have to go to the embassy, a consulate, and of course, if you're detained, then that they're not going to be offering to have you be doing a power of attorney. So.
Right.
So getting those things done before you need them, and like I said, those are things that every American really should have. So even my clients who their children turn 18, as soon as they turn 18, we want to get those things in place. So it's a good thing to have, and especially right now, it's even more important. So let's talk now about if somebody decides that they're just not comfortable here in the US anymore. They want to leave.
Okay.
Uh, and we'll say maybe they just want to ride out this administration and hope things change. Maybe they just want to pack it in and say, I'm just done with this country. Can you tell us a little bit about the immigration? Like, what do they do for, what thoughts do you have on, I guess we'll take the first one in terms of they want to leave, but maybe keep the right to come, keep that option of coming back.
So I think you always need to maintain a clean immigration record. And so for a non-immigrant, for example, let's say somebody's here on an E2 visa, they're running their own company, or they're working for some other corp company on an H-1B, for example. If they plan to leave, the best thing to do is to notify immigration, or if it's an E2 visa, for example, notify the embassy or consulate where they got their visa to let them know that they're withdrawing or ending that status voluntarily. What you don't want to do is leave and still have time left on your work visa, and then you're not maintaining that status. And then when you come back in, you have to essentially tell the officer that you're continuing in that status when you abandoned it, right? So if your intention is clear, you always want to carry forth actions that are aligned with that intent. So if your intent is to leave your current status, then that's what you do, right? If you're a permanent resident, you have to think twice about how you do this. Will you just temporarily leave and come back? Will you, let's say, take a 2-year sabbatical in your home country or do a master's degree or something? Then you need to sign up for what's called a re-entry permit, where you're stating your purpose. I'm leaving for this amount of time, but I'm intending to return as a permanent resident, so you don't lose it, right? And if you decide to renounce your permanent residence, I always tell people make sure that you have a backup plan in case you want to return. So some people's status for or eligibility for a green card is permanent. Like let's say you're still married to the US citizen that sponsored your original green card. If you both move out of the country and you stay married, at any time you're eligible for a new green card, right? But a lot of people like employment-based or investment-based green cards, that opportunity or that offer or that sponsorship is gone. So if you renounce your green card, then you're giving up that status and then you have to start from the bottom again. And so it's really important for people not to react. People can be reactionary and just say, I'm moving. But then the consequences on every level, but certainly on an immigration level, can be pretty drastic because you can't just reactivate the green card. That's a misnomer. People think I gave up my green card, I can just reactivate it anytime I want. Once you've abandoned it or renounced it, then sometimes there's no way, and you'd have to start from scratch anyway if you were still eligible. So it really is about planning. And this is funny. I had this conversation yesterday. Somebody said, I'm thinking about giving up my citizenship. Well, they don't have, if you don't have citizenship somewhere else, then you're a person of no nation. You have no status. So it seems silly, but you don't want to end up like Tom Hanks in the movie The Terminal and not have a nationality anymore, right? So if you you don't want to give up your citizenship, your US citizenship, without having dual nationality at the very least. And the same goes for a green card. You want to make sure that you're still welcome in your home country and that you can function or you have status somewhere else set up so you can reside. You don't want to be a someone who has no place to live, right? It seems like a very simple concept, but people when they make reaction decisions as opposed to reasoned ones, as you know, there's never good consequences there. So really think through this before you take action.
Yeah, and also, I mean, I think it's good to be aware that, while the US is a, it's not what we would hope and had expected it would be, in terms of protections, that other countries can just as easily slip into a similar or even worse situation. So just, it's not, there's no, I don't, I feel like, there's no country that there's no risk in. And so even if you go somewhere else, it's, the US, at least historically, is sort of a good protection to have or fallback to have. So I think it is good to sort of just think about that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure we would both agree, Shannon, the reason we went to law school, one of them is because the US has been a standard bearer in terms of that, right? It's almost, I always saw it as an absolute that everybody had protections and everybody was given due process. And so comparatively, no matter how difficult, even through the recessions and things that we've had, people have still opted to live in the US versus other places. As long as the rule of law is applied. And that's what we're seeing is in flux right now. I hope the next time we do one of these, everything will be restored and back to normal. I think that that's going to cause a greater wave. Right now, I am definitely seeing a lot of people put their plans on pause in terms of inbound and making that final decision because you want to know that you are going to be protected and have the freedom to grow and expand your business and live your life, right? And I think people are in sort of wait and see mode right now.
So, yeah. Okay. So, and if you do have a green card and you decide to leave, but you want to keep your green card, uh, I think there's some requirements about making sure you have some kind of presence here. Can you explain what that is and what?
Sure. I'll just do the sort of basic summary. The first thing is it's about there's two concerns. There's intent. They're always looking at what your intentions are, and the other is just the numbers. So in order to be safe, you want to spend more than half of each calendar year in the United States. When they see a pattern every time you enter that you're spending less and less time in the US, what you're doing is weakening the ties that you're supposed to have with the US because you can, as you know, only have one primary residence, right? There's only one country where you can be there more than half the time means that that is your primary residence. And that is the expectation for maintaining permanent residence. So the first thing I say to people is if you if you qualify for citizenship, you should apply. Because the irony of being a US citizen and being naturalized is you don't have any restrictions on how much time you spend in the US. You could go and move to New Zealand or Zimbabwe or wherever you want, and then you always have the freedom to return to the US at the drop of a hat and start a new chapter of your life. But if you're a resident, you're always subject to either abandonment or revocation of your green card. And that is not just if you commit a deportable crime or something that makes you ineligible to stay in the US. It is if you abandon, and that's perception. Abandonment means you are spending so much time abroad that they can just infer that your intent is really to not live in the US. Or You spend more than one consecutive year outside the US. If you do that, then you have to apply for a visa, special visa from the embassy in the country you're living, US Embassy, to allow you to return. But you have to prove that you will be resuming your life. And that goes to the intention, right? 2 years of continuous presence outside the US means that you are considered to have abandoned your green card status and you will lose it. So people have to keep these things in mind and they should be honest about their intent, Shannon. That's why I talked about the re-entry permit. We did a lot of those during the pandemic because people said, you know what, I don't want to be in the US. I want to be somewhere where it's more free, like Sweden or wherever it is. And so we're going to say for the next year or two, my intention is to be abroad temporarily and return. So if somebody has a plan where they want to be somewhere else for a while, it's best to apply for the re-entry permit. Then you have the option to sort of resume your permanent residence after. If you're going to resign it, you resign it. And for tax reasons, as you know, some people make those decisions also, but you have to think about the tax consequences of doing that also.
Yeah, and we'll kind of take it from there in terms of the tax implications. So, if you're just here on a temporary visa, whether that be like some kind of student visa, employment visa that's just temporary, you can leave the US and you can be free of US tax consequences. There's not going to be adverse tax consequences for leaving the US. If you have a green card and you had the green card for, well, let's say more than 7 years, a sort of a calculation, but it's somewhere between 7 and 8 years, then you could be subject to what's called expatriation taxes. And that means that you may have to accelerate any capital gains taxes upon leaving. And also, you can have a punitive estate tax on assets that are left to any US beneficiaries. So, generally, if you are a green card holder or you are a US citizen, you have an exemption right now at the federal level of around $14 million. You can leave $14 million to anyone really, and not have to pay any estate tax on that. If you are subject to these expatriation rules, it's called a covered expatriate, then there is no exemption at all for any assets left to a US beneficiary. So that means there's a 40% tax on anything if your kids are US residents or if they are US citizens, that they will have to pay 40% tax on anything that they inherit. So a lot of people don't realize that, and they leave, they give up their green card, and this can be a real issue later on. It's also really important to go through the proper channels and proper process with respect to immigration. If you are going to abandon your green card, like look at that timeline. If you're going to do it and you're close to that 7 year mark, I would do it before you're going to be subject to these expatriation rules. So those are things to consider in terms of like when you're going to leave, if you're going to leave. Sometimes people leave, kind of what Steve was talking about, of thinking like, oh, I'm temporarily leaving. And then, especially, I think we have to be really careful about this, particularly with that intent standard that you were talking about, because
Mm.
as we see this administration, they're going to be super aggressive on that, right? They're
Yeah,
going to,
they will always infer intent wherever they can.
yeah. And so if you may not think you're giving up your green card, but they may have other ideas. And even if you don't voluntarily give up the green card, if it's after this period, this 7 year period, and they revoke your green card, you're still going to be subject to this tax. So even if this revocation, if the relinquishment of the green card is not voluntary, you're basically put into this category where One, any US beneficiaries could have a big inheritance tax, and two, any capital gains are going to be accelerated. So if you have stock, and we see this a lot with like founders or people who have stock from an employer, then a huge, a big part of your net worth could be tied up in that. And having an accelerated capital gains tax, even if you're not selling, and often you can't sell, then that's going to be a really big hit, and you might not even have the liquidity to pay that. Other things are your IRAs, 401ks, things like that. You have to be paying taxes on that. So if you are going to be spending time outside of the US, I would say one, make it short if you plan on coming back. And then two, if you don't plan on coming back or you want to take that chance, that you want to think about the tax implications before you go ahead and do that.
Yeah, I think there's this, we always talk about precaution, prevention, planning. I think these kind of extreme situations that we see on TV and what's happening in these cases and this potential ban and all these proactive measures that are not pro-immigrant, I think they might tend to accelerate people's decision making to make it more reactive. And I think people really need to take an extra step back now and maybe even add a little bit more time in terms of planning and really thinking through the pluses and the minuses of every decision that they make, because sometimes getting on that plane can change your future and have a lot of sort of a snowball effect on all different things, not just your productivity or the place where you reside, but also your assets and your family, and you need to protect those even more. So I think people need to take a deep breath and really to take a further step back. And like we talked about in the beginning, really wait and see how things are playing out and talk to the professionals that you need, that you trust to make a decision. And that decision, Shannon, we always talk about should be multidisciplined. It should cover every aspect of your life. It shouldn't just be what are the immigration consequences or just what are the tax or trust and estates consequences or any other, right? It should be made in a holistic, cohesive way. And you need to work with everybody who's on the same page to make sure you're making the right decisions.
Great. Thanks so much, Steve. I just want to, if anybody has questions, if you want to put in the chat or the Q&A, we can answer those. But I think this has been great. Thank you so much for joining us I know you're really busy these days, so
Yeah, but I think this is our roles as trusted advisors, Shannon, have never been more important than in times of crisis. And this is one of those situations where people need the right information. I'm usually dispelling what people have heard more than I'm able to just proactively tell them. So any opportunity to educate is really important for us as practitioners.
great. Yeah, and I think in terms of, sort of where we have an approach of planning in advance, both from kind of coordinating, this is what we've discussed before, kind of coordinating that immigration and tax, estate planning. We set up trust. There's things that we can do to kind of minimize that tax hit, but we want to be making the decision as kind of from a holistic perspective.
Exactly.
Okay, so thank you so much, Steve, for joining us today. And I'm sure we will hopefully be having you back and under a better environment than we are currently.